Marcus Williams walked through the aisles of the supermarket, casually selecting items for dinner. It was just another Tuesday evening, and the familiar sound of carts rolling and people chatting surrounded him. As a veteran of the U.S. Army, he often found solace in the mundane moments of everyday life, cherishing the simplicity that had eluded him during his time in combat. However, the peace of that ordinary evening was abruptly shattered. As he reached for a can of black beans, he noticed two police officers, Officer Miller and Officer Johnson, entering the store. Their expressions were tense, and Marcus felt an uneasy knot in his stomach. He continued shopping, but an instinctive unease lingered. Moments later, he heard his name being called, and he turned to see Officer Miller approaching him, flanked by Officer Johnson. "Hey you!" Miller barked, a hint of arrogance dripping from his voice. "We need to talk to you." Marcus's heart raced. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, attempting to keep his voice calm. "Yeah, we've had reports of someone stealing around here, and you fit the description," Miller said, crossing his arms over his chest. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and unjust. "What?" "I'm just here shopping," Marcus replied, confusion and anger mixing within him. "I've done nothing wrong." Officer Johnson stepped forward, his demeanor equally confrontational. "Save it. We need to check your bags. You know how it is." The pressure of the moment mounted, and Marcus felt the weight of their eyes upon him. "I don't have to let you check anything," he stated firmly, frustration rising in his chest. "I'm not a criminal. I'm just a man shopping for dinner." Miller stepped closer, his gaze cold and dismissive. "You can either cooperate or we'll have to detain you. Your choice." At that moment, a chill ran down Marcus's spine. The memories of his service flooded back, the times he had been underestimated and marginalized. "I've served this country. You can't treat me like this just because of the color of my skin," he said, raising his voice slightly, desperation creeping into his words. Johnson's eyes narrowed. "This isn't about your service. This is about your behavior. And right now you're acting suspiciously. What about that man over there?" Marcus gestured towards a white customer nearby who was shopping without any scrutiny. "He's carrying more than I am, yet he's not being questioned." Miller laughed mockingly. "Don't try to play the race card. This isn't about race, it's about the facts." The indignation burned within Marcus. "It is about race. You're making assumptions based solely on my appearance. This is wrong." But his voice was drowned out by the murmurs of other customers who had begun to take notice. Some looked on with sympathy, while others seemed to enjoy the spectacle unfolding before them. In that moment he realized he was not just fighting for himself but for every person who had been wronged by a system that judged them without understanding. The tension escalated as Officer Miller reached for his radio, signaling for backup, further tightening the grip of fear that had begun to surround him. Marcus felt the blood rushing in his ears, his heart pounding in protest. "You're making a mistake. I'm just trying to buy groceries," he exclaimed, feeling trapped. And just like that, he was no longer a veteran. He was merely a suspect in the eyes of those who were supposed to protect him. As the tension in the air thickened, Marcus felt a wave of anxiety wash over him. The two officers stood before him, their expressions hard and unyielding. The stares of the other shoppers bore down on him, some filled with pity, while others were tinged with judgment. The reality of the situation was suffocating. "Stand still and don't move," Miller barked, and the order felt more like a threat than a command. The supermarket, which had once been a haven for him, now felt like a cage, trapping him in a nightmare he couldn't escape. As Officer Johnson moved closer, Marcus's mind raced. He had fought for his country, risking his life for the very freedoms he now felt stripped of. "I'm not a criminal. I don't have anything to hide," he shouted, frustration pouring from him. Miller took a step closer, an arrogant smirk on his face. "Is that so? Then why do you look so nervous?" he sneered, leaning into Marcus's personal space. The officer's breath was heavy with disdain. "Because this is ridiculous. I'm being targeted for no reason," Marcus replied, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and humiliation. He tried to stand tall, but the weight of the moment threatened to crush him. Just then another officer, a heavy-set man with a scowl, arrived on the scene. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking at Marcus with skepticism. "Just checking this guy out," Miller replied dismissively. "He's acting suspiciously, and we're conducting an investigation." "Investigating what? A man buying groceries?" Marcus interjected, the words tumbling out of his mouth. "You're making a fool out of yourselves?" The heavy-set officer rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed. "You need to cooperate. It'll go easier for you if you just comply," he grumbled, crossing his arms as if Marcus was nothing more than an inconvenience. Marcus felt his heart sink further. He glanced around the store, searching for support, but the patrons had turned away, pretending to mind their own business. A sense of isolation enveloped him, and he felt utterly powerless. "Can't you see I'm not doing anything wrong?" he pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice. "Enough," Miller shouted, raising his hand as if to silence Marcus. "You're coming with us. We'll sort this out in the back." As they turned to lead him away, a wave of humiliation crashed over Marcus. "This is unbelievable," he shouted, struggling to break free. "You're making a huge mistake." "Just shut up," Johnson snapped, gripping Marcus's arm tighter. The physical contact sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. The trio moved toward a secluded area of the store where a small office was located. The fluorescent lights buzzed above them, illuminating the gray walls that seemed to close in around him. Marcus's mind raced with thoughts of how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. This was a matter of dignity, identity, and the very essence of who he was. As they entered the office, the heavy-set officer closed the door, and the oppressive silence that followed felt suffocating. Miller gestured for Marcus to sit in a chair, but he refused, standing defiantly instead. "I'm not going to let you treat me like this," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "You have no right to detain me without evidence." Miller scoffed. "Evidence? We've got a good hunch and that's enough. You think your military service gives you a free pass? We've seen plenty of soldiers turn rogue." At that moment, Marcus felt the world tilt beneath him. "You're judging me based on my appearance, my race, and your own biases. That's not right." "I don't care about your sob story," Johnson spat, stepping closer. "What matters is that you're in the wrong place at the wrong time." The room was tense, and Marcus could feel the anger bubbling inside him. "I'm here to buy groceries. If I were a white man, would you be treating me this way?" Miller and Johnson exchanged glances, their expressions revealing a mixture of disdain and indifference. "You're playing the victim card and we're not buying it," Miller said, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. In that moment, Marcus realized the depths of their prejudice. He was a target, a statistic in their minds. The walls of the small office felt like they were closing in, and the reality of his situation hit him hard. "I want to speak to a superior," he demanded, his voice rising again. "You have no right to treat me like this." Miller shrugged, feigning disinterest. "Good luck with that. You're just another suspect to us." Marcus's heart raced as he struggled to contain his emotions. He felt a mix of anger and sorrow, not just for himself but for all those who had faced similar injustices. The thought of being treated as less than human because of the color of his skin was infuriating. "Mark my words," he said, his voice steady and fierce. "I won't let this go. I will fight back." As the officers exchanged amused glances, Marcus knew deep down that this was not just a battle for his dignity, it was a fight for justice, a fight that he was determined to win. The tension in the small office was palpable, and Marcus felt the heat of humiliation suffocating him. The officers leaned back in their chairs, their expressions a mix of arrogance and contempt. He clenched his fists, struggling to maintain control over his emotions. "Let's get this over with," Miller said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're not getting out of here until we sort this out." "Sort what out?" Marcus shot back, his frustration boiling over. "You have nothing to sort. You've already decided I'm guilty based on your assumptions." Johnson scoffed, leaning forward. "Assumptions? You think you're special just because you served in the military? You're not above the law, buddy." The words stung, cutting deeper than Marcus expected. "I didn't say I was above the law. I'm saying that I deserve to be treated with respect. You have no idea who I am or what I've been through." Miller leaned in, eyes narrowing. "So tell us, who are you? Just another black guy in a supermarket, right? What makes you so different?" Marcus felt his heart race as anger surged through him. "I'm a veteran. I served my country. I fought for my country's freedom, and yet here I am, treated like a criminal because of the color of my skin." A moment of silence hung in the air, but the officers remained unfazed. "A veteran or not, that doesn't give you a free pass," Miller said, a smug smile spreading across his face. But just then there was a knock on the door, breaking the tension. A young officer stepped inside, looking uncertain. "Chief wanted me to check in on this," he said, glancing nervously at Marcus and then at the two officers. Miller waved him off. "We're fine here," he said dismissively. "No, we're not fine," Marcus interjected, the desperation in his voice rising. "This isn't fine. I'm being falsely accused and detained without cause." The young officer hesitated, then shifted his weight uncomfortably. Maybe I should inform the chief about this, he suggested cautiously, looking at Marcus with a hint of sympathy. Miller shot him a warning glare. Don't get involved. You'll regret it. But the younger officer was already taking a step back, clearly conflicted. I think it's best if I let him know, he said, turning on his heel and quickly leaving the room. Marcus's heart raced with the possibility that someone might finally recognize the injustice unfolding before them. He seized the moment. See? Even your own colleagues can see this is wrong. Johnson rolled his eyes, but Marcus could sense a crack in their bravado. Let's just wait for the chief, Miller said, crossing his arms defensively. You'll see. We'll have you out of here in no time. The minutes felt like hours as they sat in silence, the weight of the situation settling over them. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his chest. He had been through so much, and now he was determined to ensure this moment would not end in silence. Finally, the door opened again and the chief of police entered. He was a tall man with an air of authority, but his face reflected concern as he looked between Marcus and the two officers. What's going on here? He asked, his voice steady but firm. We were just conducting a routine investigation, Miller replied, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his tone. A routine investigation? The chief echoed, his eyebrows raised. On a citizen shopping for groceries? Marcus seized the moment. I'm being accused of stealing when all I was doing was shopping for dinner. These officers have treated me with nothing but disrespect. The chief's gaze shifted to Marcus, his expression softening. Is that true? Marcus nodded, his voice steady. Yes, sir. I've done nothing wrong, and yet I've been detained and humiliated in front of others. The chief turned back to Miller and Johnson, his voice low but filled with authority. You need to take a step back and evaluate your actions. This is not how we treat our citizens. We are here to protect, not to harass. Miller opened his mouth to protest, but the chief cut him off. I'm not interested in excuses. We'll be reviewing the security footage, and if it shows you've made an error, there will be consequences. At that moment, a wave of relief washed over Marcus, but he still felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach. Thank you for hearing me out, he said, his voice quiet but resolute. I just want the truth to come out. The chief nodded, his demeanor firm yet understanding. You have every right to be treated with respect, and I assure you we will investigate this matter thoroughly. If you need anything, my office is open. With that, the chief turned to leave, but not before giving Marcus a reassuring nod. As he exited the office, Marcus felt the tension begin to lift. Perhaps there was still hope for justice. The door closed behind the chief, leaving the room silent once again. Miller and Johnson exchanged uncomfortable glances, their arrogance fading in the face of authority. Let's get you out of here, Miller grumbled, his tone lacking its previous bravado. As they led Marcus back toward the store, he felt a renewed sense of determination. This was not the end, it was merely a turning point. He was not just a victim. He was a fighter ready to seek justice for himself and for everyone who had been wronged. With each step, Marcus knew that his voice would be heard, and he would not back down until the truth prevailed. As Marcus emerged from the back office, the fluorescent lights of the supermarket felt almost blinding after the dim atmosphere he had just left. The murmurs of shoppers swirled around him, and he could feel their eyes on him, a mix of curiosity and sympathy. He straightened his posture, forcing himself to walk with dignity despite the humiliation he had endured. Miller and Johnson escorted him toward the exit, their earlier bravado replaced by a sullen silence. The tension was palpable and Marcus could sense their discomfort. As they reached the front of the store, he noticed a small crowd of customers who had witnessed the incident, their expressions a blend of disbelief and concern. What are you going to do now? One woman asked hesitantly, stepping forward. She had witnessed the confrontation and looked genuinely worried. I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen again, Marcus replied, his voice firm. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has been treated unfairly. Miller rolled his eyes, visibly annoyed. Let's move on, he muttered, clearly eager to escape the situation. But Marcus stood his ground. You need to understand the impact of your actions. You may have dismissed me, but others are watching. They deserve to feel safe too. Johnson shot him a glare, but Marcus ignored it. The crowd had begun to gather, listening intently to his words. He felt a sense of empowerment, as if his experience had transformed him into a voice for others who couldn't speak up. The woman who had spoken earlier nodded, her eyes filled with determination. You're right. We need to stand together against this kind of treatment. Feeling the energy shift, Marcus turned to the crowd. We need to hold our officers accountable. We deserve to be treated with respect regardless of the color of our skin. We cannot allow fear to silence us. As he spoke, he felt the tension in the air begin to shift. A few others in the crowd started to nod in agreement, their expressions resolute. Marcus's heart swelled with hope. This was what he had fought for, not just for himself but for all those who had been oppressed and marginalized. "Do you have a plan?" someone from the crowd asked. "I will be speaking to a lawyer and filing a complaint," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "And I encourage anyone who has experienced similar treatment to come forward. We need to stand together and demand change." Miller, visibly agitated, interrupted. "You can't just stir up trouble for no reason. We were doing our job." "Your job is to protect and serve, not to intimidate and harass," Marcus shot back, his voice rising. "You need to own up to your mistakes and learn from them. Ignoring your biases only perpetuates the problem." The crowd grew more animated, their murmurs growing louder. Marcus could feel the energy shift. They were no longer passive bystanders but active participants in a movement for change. Miller, sensing the tide turning against him, stepped forward. "This isn't over. We'll be filing a report of our own," he warned, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "Go ahead," Marcus replied, standing firm. "But I won't be silenced. You've already lost your credibility with this community." With that, Marcus turned away from the officers, who seemed to retreat into themselves, their authority stripped away in the eyes of the growing crowd. As he walked toward the exit, he could hear snippets of conversation among the onlookers. "Did you see how they treated him?" one person exclaimed. "This needs to stop. They can't keep getting away with this," another replied, determination resonating in their voice. As Marcus stepped outside into the cool evening air, he felt a sense of empowerment wash over him. He had taken a stand, and although the fight was far from over, he knew he had the support of those around him. A group of supporters gathered around him, ready to stand with him. "What's the next step?" one man asked, his eyes bright with determination. "I think it's time to organize a meeting," Marcus replied, feeling a fire ignite within him. "We need to bring awareness to this issue, invite others who have had similar experiences, and hold a community discussion. Together we can start to make a difference." As they began to brainstorm ideas and share contact information, Marcus felt a wave of hope. The experience had not only revealed the ugly reality of racial profiling but also sparked a desire for change within the community. He knew the journey ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to fight for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been affected by systemic injustice. As he stood among a group of people united in purpose, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was only the beginning. Together they would forge a path toward understanding, justice, and equality, determined to create a world where everyone could feel safe and respected. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the small park where Marcus had decided to hold the community gathering. He had spent the last few days spreading the word, and now, as he set up a makeshift podium with a few crates stacked together, he felt a surge of anticipation mixed with anxiety. Families arrived, bringing their children, while others came alone, each person drawn by the desire to stand against injustice. The atmosphere buzzed with a sense of purpose. Marcus took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. He had been preparing his speech in his head, but now, standing before this crowd, he felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. As more people gathered, Marcus noticed familiar faces among the crowd, the woman who had stood up for him in the store, a few neighbors, and even some local activists he recognized from previous protests. Their presence provided him with reassurance, a reminder that he was not alone in this fight. He stepped onto the crates and raised his hands, signaling for everyone to quiet down. The chatter subsided and all eyes turned to him. He could feel the collective energy of the crowd, their hope and determination resonating in the air. "Thank you all for coming today," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in his stomach. "I stand before you not just as a veteran but as a man who has faced injustice, an injustice that many of you have also faced. Today we gather not just to share our stories but to ignite a movement for change." A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd, and Marcus could see nods of agreement, encouraging him to continue. It's easy to feel powerless when we encounter discrimination and racism, especially from those sworn to protect us. I felt that powerlessness just a few days ago in the supermarket, but what I learned is that we have the power to change the narrative. We can't remain silent, and we must not let fear hold us back. A young woman in the front raised her hand. "What can we do to help?" she asked, her voice sincere. "That's the spirit," Marcus replied, his heart warming at her enthusiasm. The first step is to share our experiences. We need to create a safe space for everyone to speak up about their encounters, whether they're similar to mine or different. We'll document these stories and use them to advocate for policy changes in our local law enforcement. Our voices need to be heard. A man in the back shouted, and we need to hold the police accountable. They can't keep getting away with this. Exactly. Marcus said, feeling the energy in the crowd rise. We will organize meetings with local officials to discuss these issues. We will bring our experiences to light and demand transparency. Together we can influence change. But it starts with us coming together as a community. The crowd erupted in applause, a wave of solidarity rippling through the park. Encouraged by their reaction, Marcus continued, we also need to educate ourselves and others about our rights. Knowledge is power. We must know what to do when we find ourselves in situations similar to mine, how to document, who to contact, and how to speak up effectively. Let's form a committee, shouted another voice from the crowd, igniting excitement among the attendees. We can meet regularly to plan our next steps. Yes. Marcus exclaimed, feeling a swell of hope. Let's create a community committee where we can meet, share our experiences, and strategize. Together we can be a formidable force for change. As he spoke, the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. It felt symbolic, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light could break through. Now, I want to open the floor for anyone who would like to share their story, Marcus said, his heart racing at the thought. You don't have to speak if you don't want to, but your voice matters. Let's make this a space of healing and empowerment. After a moment of hesitation, the woman who had stood by him in the supermarket stepped forward. I'll go first, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I've lived in this neighborhood for years and I've seen things I wish I hadn't. Just last month, I witnessed an officer stop a young man simply for walking home. It's like we're living in a nightmare. The crowd listened intently as she spoke, her words resonating deeply. Marcus could see others in the audience nodding in agreement, and it encouraged more people to step forward. One by one, stories were shared, tales of discrimination, profiling, and fear. As each person spoke, the crowd grew more unified, their stories weaving a tapestry of shared experiences. Marcus listened, feeling both heartbroken and inspired. After a few stories, a young man stood up, his voice trembling with emotion. I'm tired of living in fear, he said, tears brimming in his eyes. I don't want my little brother to grow up in a world where he has to worry about being treated like a criminal just because of his skin color. That's why we're here. Marcus exclaimed, his voice rising above the crowd. We're here to fight for a future where our children can grow up free from fear. We owe it to them to make a change. The crowd erupted in cheers, a wave of energy pulsing through the park. Together, they were more than individuals. They were a community united by a shared vision of justice and equality. As the gathering continued, Marcus felt an overwhelming sense of hope. They were not merely speaking into the void, they were building a movement. And with every story shared, every voice lifted, they were one step closer to making a difference. In that moment, Marcus realized that the fight for justice was not just his alone, it was theirs as a community. Together, they would rise, united in their purpose, ready to confront the injustices of the world head-on. The gathering in the park had energized the community, but as the days passed, the reality of the fight ahead began to set in. Marcus was determined to push forward, but he knew that change wouldn't come easily. The following week, he scheduled a meeting with local officials, inviting everyone from the gathering to attend. On the day of the meeting, the small conference room was packed. Community members filled every seat, their faces a mixture of determination and apprehension. Marcus stood at the front, feeling the weight of their hopes resting on his shoulders. The tension was palpable. Everyone was eager for change, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead hung in the air. As the local officials entered the room, Marcus noticed the varied expressions on their faces. Some looked curious, others dismissive, and a few appeared genuinely concerned. He felt his heart race as the officials took their seats, but he reminded himself of the importance of this moment. Thank you all for coming today, Marcus began, his voice steady. We're here to discuss the recent events that have sparked a much-needed conversation about racial profiling and police accountability in our community. The officials nodded, some jotting down notes while others exchanged skeptical glances. Marcus continued, we have gathered here not just as individuals, but as a community that demands to be heard. We want to share our experiences and advocate for changes that will ensure every citizen is treated with dignity and respect. A middle-aged man with a stern expression leaned forward. And what changes are you suggesting? he asked, his tone laced with skepticism. We propose several initiatives, Marcus replied, his confidence growing. First, we need better training for our law enforcement officers on racial sensitivity and de-escalation tactics. We believe this will help prevent situations like mine from occurring in the future. A woman in the back raised her hand. And we want body cameras. Transparency is key. If officers know they're being recorded, they'll think twice before acting on their biases. Exactly. Marcus exclaimed, encouraged by her input. We also want to establish a community oversight board. This board would review complaints against officers and hold them accountable for their actions. The officials exchanged glances, some appearing thoughtful while others looked dismissive. We understand your concerns, one of the officials said, trying to maintain a diplomatic tone. But implementing these changes isn't as simple as it sounds. There are budgets and regulations to consider. We understand that, Marcus replied, feeling the frustration bubbling up inside him. But how much is a life worth? How many more lives have to be affected by these issues before we take action? We're asking you to prioritize the safety and dignity of every member of this community. The room fell silent, the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air. He could see the flicker of realization in some of the officials' eyes, but others remained resistant. A young woman who had attended the gathering stood up. We're not just asking. We're demanding that you take our concerns seriously. We will not be silenced. The tension in the room escalated, and the officials exchanged nervous glances. Marcus took a deep breath, channeling the strength of the community behind him. Together we have the power to bring about change, he said, his voice rising. But we need your support. We're willing to work with you, but we need to see genuine commitment from you. One of the older officials, a woman with gray hair, finally spoke up. I understand your frustration. I've seen the disparities in our community, and I've fought for change in the past. But I need to know that this group is organized and committed. We can't do this alone. We're ready to work together, Marcus replied, his voice steady. We want to form a task force that includes both community members and officers to discuss these issues regularly. Let's open a dialogue and start making progress. The room erupted in murmurs, some in support and others still resistant. The tension was thick, but for the first time, Marcus sensed a crack in the official's armor. After a long pause, the older woman nodded slowly. If you can organize your community and present a unified front, we may be able to move forward together. Then let's do it, Marcus said, feeling the adrenaline coursing through him. Let's take the first step today. We'll schedule follow-up meetings, gather input from the community, and develop a plan. As the meeting continued, Marcus could see the tide slowly turning. Community members spoke up, sharing their stories and frustrations, while the officials began to listen, truly listen for the first time. By the end of the meeting, there was a palpable sense of hope in the air. They had opened a door to dialogue, and for the first time, change felt possible. As people began to leave the room, Marcus lingered, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. He had taken a significant step, but he knew the journey ahead would be long and challenging. Suddenly, the young officer who had intervened during his detainment approached him. Marcus, I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened that day, he said, his voice earnest. I didn't realize the full extent of the situation until I saw the impact it had on you and the community. I want to be part of the solution. Marcus was taken aback, surprised by the officer's humility. Thank you, he replied, feeling a flicker of hope. It takes courage to admit mistakes, and I appreciate you reaching out. Together, we can work toward making a difference. As he left the meeting, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were on the brink of change, and he was determined to see it through. With the support of the community and allies emerging from unexpected places, Marcus knew that together, they would create a future where justice prevailed. In the weeks following the meeting, the momentum within the community began to build. Marcus, fueled by a newfound sense of purpose, organized a series of workshops aimed at educating residents about their rights and the importance of community engagement. The response was overwhelming. Each session was met with eager participants ready to learn and share their experiences. The first workshop was held in the local community center. The room was filled with chairs, and as people filed in, Marcus felt a surge of excitement. This was their chance to empower one another, to turn their pain into action. Welcome everyone, Marcus said, stepping up to the front of the room. I'm thrilled to see so many faces here today. We're here to discuss our rights as citizens and how we can support one another in holding law enforcement accountable. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. He could see familiar faces from the park gathering, their expressions filled with determination. To start, I want to share some basic rights that we all have when interacting with law enforcement, he began. You have the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, and the right to refuse searches without a warrant. Knowing these rights can make a significant difference in how we navigate these situations. He presented scenarios that could occur during police encounters, encouraging the participants to role-play and practice what they had learned. Laughter erupted during some of the exercises, lightening the mood and fostering a sense of camaraderie. As the workshop continued, attendees began to share their own stories. A young man named Jalen stood up, his voice shaking but filled with conviction. Last month, I was stopped by an officer just for walking home from a friend's house. They said I looked suspicious. It felt humiliating and scary, he shared, his eyes filled with frustration. Marcus nodded, encouraging others to support Jalen. You're not alone in this, Jalen. Many of us have faced similar situations. That's why we're here, to ensure we have each other's backs. Another woman chimed in, I was stopped for speeding, but the officer made me feel like I was a criminal. I didn't even do anything wrong. Her voice cracked, but she continued, it's exhausting to feel like I have to prove my innocence just because of the color of my skin. As the stories poured out, Marcus felt a mixture of anger and compassion. Each experience echoed the painful reality many faced, but he also felt a sense of empowerment growing in the room. After several hours of sharing and learning, Marcus wrapped up the workshop, encouraging everyone to spread the word about the importance of community engagement. We need to keep this momentum going, he urged. Let's organize more workshops, reach out to other neighborhoods, and create a network of support. Together, we can be a powerful force for change. As the attendees filed out, many expressed their gratitude, sharing how they felt inspired to take action. Marcus watched as they exchanged contact information, forming new friendships and alliances. It was a beautiful sight, and he felt a swell of pride at what they were building together. A few days later, Marcus was preparing for the second workshop when he received a call from the local news station. They wanted to feature his efforts and the community's response to the recent events. Excitement coursed through him. This was an opportunity to amplify their message and reach even more people. On the day of the interview, the news crew arrived at the community center, setting up cameras and microphones. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the familiar mix of nerves and adrenaline. This was his chance to advocate for change on a larger platform. As the cameras rolled, Marcus spoke passionately about the importance of community involvement and the need for accountability in law enforcement. He shared the stories of those who had bravely come forward, emphasizing the collective strength they were building. This isn't just about one person's experience, it's about creating a future where everyone feels safe and respected, he stated, his voice unwavering. We will not back down until we see real change in our community. The reporter nodded, clearly moved by Marcus's words. What do you hope to achieve through these workshops and community gatherings? She asked. I hope to empower individuals to stand up for their rights and to create a network of support where we can share our experiences and learn from one another, Marcus replied, his determination shining through. Together, we can influence policy changes and hold those in power accountable. As the interview concluded, Marcus felt a sense of accomplishment. This was only the beginning, but he knew that by sharing their stories, they could inspire others to take action and join the fight for justice. Later that evening, as he watched the news broadcast, Marcus felt a mix of pride and hope. The segment highlighted the community's efforts and the importance of standing together against injustice. People began reaching out to him, expressing their support and interest in getting involved. However, with the growing attention also came backlash. Marcus began receiving anonymous threats on social media, warning him to stop his activism. At first, he felt a surge of fear, but then he remembered the stories of those who had suffered in silence for too long. This is just a sign that we're making a difference, he said to himself, steeling his resolve. He shared the threats with his community, and instead of allowing fear to take hold, they rallied around him, ready to support one another. The following week, Marcus received a call from the local police department. They wanted to meet with him to discuss the community's concerns further. While part of him felt apprehensive, he also saw it as an opportunity to engage in dialogue and advocate for change directly. Let's do this, he thought, feeling a mixture of nerves and determination. It's time to confront them face to face. As he prepared for the meeting, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle upon him again. This was a chance to not only speak for himself but for the entire community that had rallied behind him. He was ready to make his voice heard, determined to fight for justice and equality at every turn. The day of the meeting arrived, and Marcus felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety as he walked into the police department. The atmosphere inside was markedly different from the community center, sterile and cold, with officers in crisp uniforms moving purposefully through the halls. The contrast between this environment and the vibrant energy of the community gatherings weighed heavily on him. He was escorted into a small conference room where several high-ranking officers were already seated. Among them was Officer Ramirez, the same young officer who had shown him kindness during his detainment. Seeing a familiar face gave Marcus a slight sense of comfort, but the seriousness of the situation quickly set in. "Thank you for coming, Marcus," the police chief said, his voice steady but authoritative. "We appreciate your willingness to engage in this conversation. We understand there are concerns in the community that we need to address." Marcus nodded, feeling the eyes of the officers on him. "Thank you for having me. I believe it's important that we have an open dialogue about the issues facing our community and law enforcement." The police chief leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "We want to understand your perspective. What specific concerns do you want to address today?" Taking a deep breath, Marcus launched into a summary of the community's experiences. "We're here to talk about racial profiling and how it affects our daily lives. Many of us feel targeted and treated unfairly based on our appearance. It's a feeling of constant fear, especially for our youth." As he spoke, he noticed Officer Ramirez nodding along, visibly engaged. "It's not just about one incident, it's about a pattern of behavior that makes us feel unsafe in our own neighborhoods." One of the officers interjected, "But you must understand that our job involves making split-second decisions based on what we see. Sometimes those decisions may seem biased, but they are based on training and protocols." Marcus could feel frustration rising within him. "I get that, but when those decisions are based on assumptions rather than facts, it leads to real harm. We need training that goes beyond just the basics, training that addresses biases and emphasizes de-escalation." Another officer, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, crossed her arms. "What do you suggest? We can't change our entire approach overnight." "I'm not asking for a magic fix," Marcus replied, his tone firm yet respectful. "I'm asking for accountability. We need body cameras for all officers on patrol, mandatory anti-bias training, and a community oversight board that includes residents to review officer conduct." The police chief raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Body cameras are expensive and require proper management and oversight. How can we ensure they're used effectively?" "We can figure it out together," Marcus said, maintaining his composure. "What's most important is that we start prioritizing transparency. If officers know they're being recorded, it could lead to more mindful policing. Plus, it creates a record for accountability when things go wrong." The room fell silent for a moment, and Marcus felt the weight of their hesitation. "I know this won't change overnight, but we have to start somewhere. If we can work together to build trust, it can lead to a safer community for everyone." Officer Ramirez spoke up, his voice earnest. "I believe we can make these changes happen. We need to involve community members in our training and ensure they understand what we're doing as officers. We want to build bridges, not walls." The police chief nodded slowly. "If we're going to make changes, it will take time and cooperation from both sides. We're willing to consider your proposals, but we need a plan in place to implement them effectively." Marcus felt a flicker of hope. "That's all we're asking for, a willingness to listen and work together. We're ready to help in any way we can." As the discussion continued, Marcus could sense a shift in the atmosphere. The officers began asking more questions, genuinely seeking to understand the community's perspective. They talked about the importance of community engagement and how to build trust. Toward the end of the meeting, the police chief addressed Marcus directly. "We appreciate your efforts and your willingness to engage with us. Let's schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss how we can move forward together and create a plan for implementation." "Thank you," Marcus replied, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "This is a positive step, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to work with you." As he left the police department, Marcus felt a mix of relief and hope. They had made progress, and it was a significant step toward bridging the gap between the community and law enforcement. In the days that followed, news of the meeting spread throughout the community. Some residents were skeptical while others felt optimistic. Marcus organized another workshop to discuss the meeting's outcomes and gather feedback from attendees. At the workshop, the atmosphere was charged with energy. Community members voiced their concerns about potential complacency, and Marcus encouraged them to stay engaged. "It's easy to feel hopeful now, but we must hold them accountable for their promises," he urged. "We need to remain vigilant and involved in every step of this process." As he spoke, a familiar face from the first gathering stood up. "How can we ensure our voices are heard during this process?" What if they don't follow through? That's why we're creating a community task force, Marcus replied. We will document our experiences, attend meetings, and advocate for our needs. We will not be silent. The crowd erupted in applause, their enthusiasm contagious. Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose as they shared ideas on how to stay engaged. Together, they brainstormed ways to monitor police actions, share updates, and keep the community informed. As the workshop wrapped up, Marcus was approached by a group of young people, their faces lit with determination. We want to help, one of them said. We're ready to stand up and fight for our rights. Marcus smiled, feeling a surge of pride. That's the spirit. You are the future of this movement. Your voices are crucial, and I encourage you to take the lead in your schools and communities. With the community more united than ever, Marcus felt the power of collective action. They were no longer just individuals sharing their stories. They had become a movement ready to take on the challenges ahead. As he left the community center that night, Marcus felt a sense of purpose coursing through him. The fight for justice was far from over, but together they were ready to face whatever came their way. As the weeks rolled on, the energy within the community remained high, but so did the tension. The dialogue with law enforcement was just beginning, and while there were signs of progress, the atmosphere was charged with anxiety. One afternoon, Marcus received a call from his friend Sarah, who had been organizing a march in support of police reform. Marcus, you need to come to the planning meeting tonight. There's been some pushback from a few groups and we need to strategize, she said, her voice tense. What kind of pushback? Marcus asked, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. Some local business owners are worried about potential violence, and there are rumors of counter-protests. We need to be prepared, she explained. Got it? I'll be there, he replied, his heart racing. The thought of opposition filled him with dread, but he also knew they couldn't back down now. That evening, as he entered the community center, he was greeted by a mix of familiar faces and new attendees. The atmosphere was electric, but a palpable undercurrent of fear lingered. Thanks for coming, everyone, Marcus began, standing at the front of the room. We're here because our voices matter, and we need to ensure this march goes smoothly. He could see Sarah at the back of the room, her brow furrowed with concern. After outlining the logistics of the march, Marcus turned to address the pushback they had faced. We understand that some community members are anxious about our actions and the possibility of violence. But we need to reassure them that this march is a peaceful demonstration for change. A young woman raised her hand, her expression earnest. What if we face aggression from counter-protesters? What's our plan then? Marcus nodded, recognizing the fear in her voice. We'll have a team trained in de-escalation strategies. Our goal is to keep the peace and not engage in any violence no matter what happens. We'll also have a designated area for those who want to speak out against injustice. We want to maintain our focus on the message of reform. As they discussed further precautions, Sarah stepped forward, visibly shaken. I heard that some people are planning to intimidate us. There are even threats being thrown around online. A tense silence fell over the room. Marcus could see the fear spreading like wildfire among the attendees. I won't lie, this could get tense. But we can't let fear silence us. We need to be united. Our message of justice and equality is more powerful than any threats, he urged. After hours of planning and strategizing, they concluded the meeting, determined to move forward despite the risks. As the participants filed out, Marcus felt a sense of responsibility weighing heavily on his shoulders. The day of the march arrived, and the air buzzed with anticipation. As Marcus approached the starting point, he was greeted by a sea of faces, young and old, black and white, all gathered in solidarity. Banners declaring messages of hope and change fluttered in the breeze. Yet, as the crowd gathered, Marcus noticed a group of individuals across the street, holding signs that contradicted their message. His heart sank. They were the counter-protesters, and their aggressive demeanor sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. Stay calm, everyone, Marcus called out, trying to maintain control. We're here for peace and justice. Let's focus on our message. As they began to march, chanting slogans for change, Marcus felt a rush of empowerment. But just as quickly the tension escalated. The counter-protesters started shouting insults and taunts, trying to provoke a reaction. Ignore them, Marcus shouted, raising his voice above the chaos. We're here for justice, not to fight. But the atmosphere thickened with hostility. He could see some members of the crowd getting restless, their anger boiling over as they shouted back at the opposing group. Suddenly, a confrontation erupted at the front of the march. A counter-protester pushed his way into their ranks, shoving a young man who was holding a banner. "Get out of here, you thugs," he yelled, his face twisted with anger. "Back off," Marcus shouted, rushing forward to intervene. He placed himself between the two men, feeling the heat of their anger radiate around him. "We're here to promote peace. This is not the way." In that moment, the situation escalated further as tensions boiled over. More voices rose in anger, and it felt as though the march could erupt into chaos at any moment. Marcus's heart raced as he desperately sought to calm the crowd. "Let's take a step back," he shouted, raising his hands to signal for calm. "This is about us, about our community. We won't let anger destroy what we're trying to achieve." But the frustration was palpable, and as the shouts grew louder, Marcus felt a sinking feeling in his gut. The beauty of their message was threatened by the hostility swirling around them. Just as the situation seemed poised to boil over, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Officer Ramirez, who had arrived with a few other officers. "We're here to support you," he said, his voice steady. "Let's keep this peaceful." Marcus nodded, grateful for their presence, but he could see that some members of the crowd were still hesitant. "We need to show them that we're not backing down," he called out to the attendees. "But we can do it peacefully." With the police backing him up, Marcus stepped forward and addressed the crowd again. "This is our moment. We will not be silenced by hate. Let's show them the strength of our unity." As the chants continued, the tension slowly began to ease. The crowd found its rhythm again, and as they marched forward, Marcus felt the powerful connection between them all. They were united, standing strong against adversity, and their voices rang out in harmony, carrying the message of justice louder than ever. The march was a statement, a testament to their resilience in the face of fear. And as Marcus led the way, he knew they had made their voices heard, proving that together they were a force for change. In the aftermath of the march, the air buzzed with a mixture of relief and exhilaration. Marcus stood among the crowd as they dispersed, feeling a sense of accomplishment wash over him. The event had remained peaceful despite the earlier tensions, and the community's determination had shown through. The next day, local news outlets covered the march extensively. Their headlines praised the peaceful nature of the demonstration, contrasting it with the attempts to incite violence from the counter-protesters. Marcus was overwhelmed by the support flooding in from around the city. It seemed that their message had resonated far beyond their immediate community. That evening he found himself back at the community center, where a gathering had been organized to discuss the next steps. The atmosphere was charged with optimism as people shared their thoughts and feelings about the march. "We need to keep this momentum going," Sarah began, her eyes bright with excitement. "This is just the beginning. We've shown that our voices matter, and we can continue pushing for real change." The attendees erupted in agreement, enthusiasm radiating throughout the room. A young woman, her voice steady, spoke up. "What if we create regular forums with the police? We could discuss issues, share our experiences, and build a relationship based on trust." "That's a fantastic idea," Marcus replied, feeling a wave of pride in the group's energy. "We should also reach out to other communities to expand our efforts and create a broader coalition for change." As they brainstormed more ideas, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. It had started with a single moment of injustice, but now they were a movement, armed with purpose and determination. In the days that followed, they organized community forums that encouraged open dialogue with local law enforcement. Officer Ramirez became a key ally, attending many of these meetings and sharing insights into police training and procedures. His presence helped to bridge the gap between the police and the community, fostering an environment of trust and understanding. The first forum was met with both excitement and anxiety. Residents filled the room, eager to voice their concerns and engage in a constructive dialogue. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus started, his heart pounding. "This is a chance for us to speak honestly about our experiences and work together to find solutions. We're here to build bridges, not walls." As the forum unfolded, community members shared their stories, some heart-wrenching, others empowering. A father spoke about his fears for his son, who often felt targeted by police. A mother recounted an incident where she felt her family was unjustly profiled. "I want my children to feel safe, not scared," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. Officer Ramirez listened intently, occasionally responding to questions and clarifying misunderstandings about police procedures. His candidness helped ease the tension, and as the forum continued, the dialogue transformed into a collaborative discussion on how to improve relations. "Can we work on implementing community-led training for officers?" Marcus proposed, looking at Officer Ramirez. "Training that involves input from residents on their experiences?" "I think that's an excellent idea," Officer Ramirez replied. "We need to learn from one another, and incorporating community input will make our training more effective." As the forum concluded, attendees left with a sense of hope. They had begun to lay the groundwork for a collaborative relationship with law enforcement, focused on mutual respect and understanding. Weeks turned into months and the movement continued to grow. Marcus, Sarah, and the others began hosting regular community meetings, attracting attention from local media and advocacy groups. Their message of reform and unity reached beyond their neighborhood, inspiring others in the city to take action. The police department, seeing the positive outcomes of their collaborative efforts, began to adopt some of the proposed changes. Body cameras were approved for all patrol officers, and mandatory bias training became a part of the ongoing education for law enforcement personnel. As the year drew to a close, Marcus stood before a crowd once again, but this time, it was at a community celebration marking the progress they had made. Families gathered, music filled the air, and there was an undeniable sense of accomplishment. "Today is a celebration of our resilience and our commitment to change," Marcus addressed the crowd, his heart swelling with pride. "We've shown that when we stand together, our voices can be heard. But this is just the beginning. We must continue to hold each other accountable and keep pushing for justice and equality." The crowd erupted in applause, their faces beaming with hope. As Marcus looked around, he saw familiar faces filled with determination, the young people who had first raised their voices, the parents who had shared their fears, and the officers who had chosen to engage rather than divide. In that moment, he understood that their journey was not just about confronting injustice. It was about building a community grounded in understanding and respect. They had turned a painful incident into a catalyst for change, proving that unity could overcome adversity. As the celebration continued, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were more than just individuals fighting for their rights. They were a family bound by shared experiences and a collective vision for a better future. With the sun setting on the horizon, Marcus smiled, knowing that together, they had taken a stand against injustice and paved the way for a more equitable world.